As a little girl, Annie had pictured how her dream wedding would go. She'd wear a white dress and walk down the aisle, looking out over a sea of smiling faces as she approached the altar. Her groom she had pictured less as a specific person and more as an amalgamation of traits she wanted. Kind eyes, a warm smile, broad shoulders, things she associated with a gentle, good-hearted man. Her mother would be alive, and her father would be sober. She had always known this little fantasy of hers had been a mess of impossibilities. She just hadn't pictured it going this awry. Running a hand over the bodice of her dress, Annie stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked morosely back out at her. One pale manicured hand ran over the bodice of her gown, fingers tracing over the thousands of crystals dotting the fabric like stars. Annie had never been this close to a diamond before. She'd certainly never thought she'd be wearing this many of them. Her auburn hair was piled on top of her head in an elaborate series of braids and curls, and there was shimmering powder swiped across the lids of her gray eyes, making them seem bigger and brighter. Annie had never looked better, and she had never felt worse. Not for the first time since she had received the news of her own impending nuptials, by way of her father drunkenly sweating through a confession, Annie cursed at the series of mundane to regrettable events that made up her life. She'd always been told growing up that if she worked hard enough, she could be and have anything she wanted. Bright-eyed idiot that she had been, she hadn't realized that it was just a condescending platitude doled out to the have-nots of the universe to make them more complacent with their lot, to shift the blame away from the people overworking and underpaying their employees. Instead, she'd planted her feet, ignored the throngs of people she'd known growing up who worked hard day in and day out and barely had enough to eat, and decided to become a politician. She'd ended up as a waitress at a dive bar instead. It hadn't been all terrible. The other servers were friendly and she got free drinks, but spending anywhere between 8 and 15 hours a day avoiding groping hands and belligerent drunks hadn't been how she wanted to spend her life. This was without her father showing up and explaining that he needed money, just this once, and that he wouldn't spend it all on cheap booze, only for a friend of his to call her to come pick him up once he'd drunk himself unconscious. At the time, it hadn't seemed like much, just a continued state of existence, tinged by the frustration that she could be so much more. Now it seemed like paradise. It was funny what made you learn to appreciate what you had. Sometimes it was a death, or a breakup, or getting fired. Sometimes it was your father telling you he'd accidentally sold you into being what amounted to a sex slave for a demonic autocrat with a warship that could eat the sun and a private army decked out in gear reminiscent of Civil War uniforms. Annie had laughed when her father had first broken the news, and she hadn't laughed again since.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.